I've preached literally thousands of sermons. But tonight, I share with you a different kind of story. It's my personal story, my battle and struggle with depression and my journey towards wholeness. The day that I hit the wall, the day that I fully understood the depths of depression and how it affected my life was a day when I literally could not get out of bed. I wanted to, but I couldn't. So I lay there in complete darkness because that's what I was feeling inside, darkness. And I was crying uncontrollably. My body was shaking. And I didn't know what was wrong with me, but I knew that it was something that I was going through, that I needed help. And I picked up the telephone, called my wife at the time, and I said to her, I need you to come home. And she said, what's wrong? I said, I don't know, but I need you to come home. And she came home, and I was there, literally under the covers, unable to move. And we reached out to a mental health professional, called a psychiatrist, and by the grace of God, I was able to get in an emergency appointment for that day. And as I went in and I talked with a professional for the first time, I talked to a person and I said, I need help. I'm in a crisis. I'm having a breakdown. And I know that this is beyond feeling blue. This is beyond I'm feeling down. I know that I'm in need of professional help right now. And so as I began this conversation with this professional, I began to learn a lot of things about myself. But the first thing she said to me was that you are having a major episode of depression. You're clinically depressed and you need help. You need medication. And when she suggested that I take medication, I initially resisted it because there was a stigma, particularly in my community, about taking medication. But I did, and she explained it to me in a way that I'd never heard. She said, this medication is not going to solve your problem, but it's going to lift the weight off of your shoulders so that you can re-engage life. And so I started taking medication. I had two forms of medication. And all my life, I've been a person of extreme highs and extreme lows. I was able to manage those pretty well. Matter of fact, the highs were pretty good because I got a lot of stuff done when I was on those highs. But the lows, over the years, they became deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's where I was on that particular day. I was in extreme low, and I couldn't pick myself back up. So I started taking this medication, and I started taking the medication and also continued with therapy, talking about issues. And there's some things I learned. I learned that my first battle, my first episode of depression happened when I was in middle school. When I was in middle school, I was a part of a group of students that was the first group of students to help integrate the Houston Independent School District. And I started attending a middle school, and the first semester of this school, we were not welcome at this school, and people were visually hostile to us as we would get off of the bus. And that was really my first episode of depression. I lost an entire semester of school. I did nothing. I went to school, I came home, and I slept, and I slept, and I slept. And the following semester, my mom took me out of the school. She put me into another place where I was able to thrive. But that was my first episode of depression, but I didn't recognize, couldn't articulate what it was. And then she also explained to me that there were some things I needed to do in terms of taking care of myself, like eating right. And there were things I needed to do in terms of understanding what my triggers were and vulnerability and all of those sort of things. Now, you have to know that here I was, a pastor, just started a new church, and things were going well on the outside, but on the inside, I was dying. And I was a pastor standing up, preaching hope, but I felt hopeless. I was talking about light, but all I felt was darkness. And so I had to come to grips with being vulnerable, that I was this person that people looked at as always having it all together. I was this person that people looked at and said, you know, he doesn't have any issues, any problems. He's always on top. But I had to come to grips with that the image, the public image that people had of me, and really struggling with dealing with my own personal reality. And for the first time in my professional life, I was vulnerable. I had to learn that it was okay for me to be vulnerable, that it was okay for me to be able to say that everything's not okay with me. And in the midst of this conversation, in the midst of this counseling experience, I also learned that I hit that wall on that particular day, but there was a lot of things that led up to me hitting that wall. One of those things was I remember just driving around the city sometimes, and I would stop at a stoplight, and I would just start crying. And I didn't know why, but I would. And I remember some days I would had reached out to a colleague, and I was telling him how I was feeling. And he said to me, "What do you have to be depressed about?" So I hid. Why am I depressed? I didn't know why, but I knew I needed help. And that was the beginning of my journey. And what I've learned and am learning over the course of all of these years is that there are still moments when I have to really fight to overcome my battle with depression. Most recently was in 2012. In 2012, I described this as the worst year of my life. In February of 2012, I lost my mother. And the loss of my mother, it threw me into another major episode of depression. And I was so low, I really honestly did not think I was going to make it out. In the same year, in August of that year, I lost my brother. Died of a heart attack, 49 years old. 2 weeks later, I lost my grandmother. She lived to be 99 years old. And then about a month after that, I lost one of my best friends from high school. In the midst of all of this activity throughout the year, I kept kept working, not really dealing with my grief, not really processing my grief. And the result of that was in November of that year, I ended up in a hospital with blood clots, pulmonary embolisms, blood clot in both of my lungs. And as I laid flat on my back in a hospital bed, it was an opportunity for me to be reminded by God of this struggle, but also that if I attended to health and the wholeness, that God could bring me through it. And so there I was, struggling, crying out again. And I was grateful, and I continue to be grateful for the things that I'm learning. Here's some things that I'm learning. I'm learning that my story matters. I'm learning that if I share my story and if I'm vulnerable with other people, that you never know who shares a similar story. You never know whose life I'm touching. I'm learning that. And I'm learning that it's okay to be vulnerable, that it's okay that I don't have to have it all together. And so I'm also learning how to overcome this stigma of battling depression and anxiety, panic attacks. I'm learning that it's okay. And so part of me dispelling the stigma is to be able to stand before you tonight and to share my story. To say it's okay. To sometimes not be okay. It's okay to struggle. And it's okay to lean on other people as you make your way to health and wholeness. Thank you for listening to my story tonight.